Hello, Will. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so excited for our listeners to hear more about who you are and your story. I know you and I connected just very recently on LinkedIn, and I am just so excited because you have such a vast variety of experiences. Your background is so full, even though you're at such a young age. So the experiences that you can draw from to share with us more about your faith journey. I'm just so excited for. And so, with that, I thought maybe we could just kick off, Will, by you telling us more about who you are and your faith story.
Yeah, absolutely. Kelsey, well, thank you for having me. So I guess, let's see, at a high level, former intelligence officer by background, been working on aerospace topics for a number of years now, and since went private sector after leaving the government. I think in the context of my own personal faith journey, I grew up going to church as a kid, went to Sunday school as a kid, right? But kind of fell out of it in my teenage years. I think, like a lot of rebellious teenagers, didn't necessarily want to go to church when I was 13 or 14 years old. I think, for a number of years for me, I think in the back of my mind, I kind of had this assumption that, okay, if God is out there, he'll make his presence known and I don't really have to do anything, and at a certain point, he'll come to me, right? If he wants me to go back to church, right? And I think that was kind of that teenage mentality that I had. And I think, there was sort of a certain point during college in my early 20s, when I had the realization that I didn't quite know what it would sound like or what it would look like if God was speaking and wanted to bring me back to church and have that influence on my life. And so I actually started looking at, what are the experiences that other people have had, right? And so I started looking at the writings of C.S. Lewis or, St. Augustine's Confessions, right? And I think a lot of those ended up being very influential for me. I think especially because, with someone like C.S. Lewis, right, he went through his own periods of questioning and doubt early on in his life as a young man. And I think, kind of getting back to the church eventually and finding his way back, I think that was really influential to look at those stories of other people to figure out what to listen for.
Hmm. I love that. Well, and I know that concept of, oh, God will come to me. It's very easy for us to go through our days and go through our lives and think, oh, I don't have to work at this. It's just gonna, I can go to church on Sunday and then move on with my life. And I can still call myself a Christian, but that's not always, God wants us to go to him and collaborate with him on a day-to-day basis. So how did you start to incorporate God more into your daily life as time went on?
Yeah, so I would say, at least initially, kind of going and looking at a lot of those historical texts and reading through those experiences that other people had, I think that kind of taught me what to listen for. And then as soon as I started listening, I think it was almost immediately apparent. And I remember, the day when I said, okay, I think I need to go back to church on Sunday because, it clicked, right? And that was actually Palm Sunday when I went back, and I was living in New York City at the time. And I think that was kind of, a big turning point for me. And I think increasingly since then, I've seen a lot of value in getting involved in small groups. I know that we'll discuss that more today as well, as well as a couple leadership experiences. I did some training with the Reformed Institute of Metropolitan Washington, focused on what it takes to actually lead a small group and build up a young adult ministry, and how you do that in a way that can help bring other people in and kind of lower that barrier to entry. And so I think that small group element ended up being really important, and I found more and more value over time in that as well.
Hmm. So tell us more about the Reform Institute. What did you learn when you were there?
Yeah, so it was, a multi-month series, kind of a small cohort-based model. And this was in Washington, D.C. at the time when I was living there. And I think one of the biggest takeaways there was that if you're looking at young adult ministry or even just small group Bible study, the most important thing you can do is lower the barrier to entry.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of people probably remember being, in middle school or high school and, getting called on in class when you didn't read that chapter in the book, right? And kind of that feeling of embarrassment of, I didn't do the reading last night. And so I think, a lot of people don't necessarily show up at small groups or Bible studies because they might feel intimidated or might feel like they didn't do the reading, or, they don't have enough of a background to really speak to certain topics. And so what we really focused on there was, you do kind of a single page reading, right? You make sure that whatever reading you're going to focus on that day can fit on a single sheet of paper. You tell everyone you don't have to read it in advance. It's totally fine. Show up even if you did no preparation. And we're going to set aside the first 5 to 10 minutes for everyone to quietly read it, even if you didn't look at it before. And then we'll get into discussion. And I think all of a sudden, attendance went, through the roof compared to what it was before, because it was much more approachable for people and they didn't feel intimidated anymore.
So less homework allowed for more people to come because they felt like they were able to participate. I can relate so much to that. I was the student in college that would show up to every class, but outside of class, I was a very bad student because I wouldn't read the assignment. I would just show up in class and I would take vigorous notes and really hone in. And I think that different people have different learning styles. So I'm sure that was able to attract more people that needed to set that time aside to do the reading together. So it kind of sounds like that creates some accountability to actually do the work, but you're just doing it together.
Yeah, and I think also focusing on maybe a shorter bit of text, because I think sometimes it's easier to try and cover too many passages at once. And, you can find something that fits on a single sheet and discuss it for hours if you want to. So I think sometimes honing in on one specific thing and doing a deeper conversation is better than trying to cover too much text all at once.
I love that. So tell us more about some of your work experiences and maybe how you've seen God in the different work experiences that you've had.
Yeah, sure. So in my former job, so former CIA officer by background, spent about 5 years undercover. And I think, for me, I always felt a calling of doing national security work, right? Of kind of the way that I would do good in the world would be to focus on the national security sector. I think part of that is, you look at the intersection of maybe your gifts and the world's needs, and that intersection is, your calling, right? But I think that takes a lot of discernment and a lot of focus over time to figure out what you're supposed to be doing, right? I think one of the most interesting things that I'd love to dive into more is the fact that sometimes your calling can change over time, right? And that sometimes, God will put you somewhere that you need to be so that you can go on a different path later on. And it kind of makes sense in retrospect, but it might be confusing at the time. And I think it might be difficult sometimes to go through that transition of believing something is your calling and then having to pivot to a different one, even when it makes perfect sense in retrospect.
So I just think this is so cool that I don't know if I've ever met someone that's been in the CIA. So Will, you might be the first one. And I have to tell our audience, I was giving you a little bit of crap before we started today because we prepped for this interview and you were just so nonchalant in, oh yeah, I was with the CIA, but you brushed over it so quickly. I think in our last conversation that I saw an article that Fargo Inc. put out about you and I was reading it and I thought, he didn't tell me he was in the CIA, but I do think you did. But this is just, it's such a cool perspective that our listeners can have. And so when you look at that experience, I mean, it sounds like you really were excited about your opportunity with the CIA. It was something that you felt was your calling. How did you sort through leaving? Because I have a feeling it was really hard to get out. And maybe I'm wrong, but how did you know that it was time to transition? And what was that experience like?
Yeah, so I think there were a couple of us actually that left around the same time. And I think for a few of us, I think we felt as if we were kind of giving the doom and gloom briefings about how China and Russia are catching up to the US on certain aerospace topics. And delivering more bad news than we were fixing in a sense. And a few of us saw a good opportunity to work in private industry to essentially try and fix the problems that we used to brief. And so I think that ended up being kind of that pivot in calling, right? Because I think when I first walked in the door, my belief was, I'm going to be an intelligence officer for the next 30, 40 years, and then I'll retire. And the next day I'll come back as a contractor and do it, for the rest of my life. And I think for me, it was, I didn't necessarily expect to ever really leave. I was planning on doing that forever, really. But I think for me, when I saw that I had a better opportunity to fix the kind of problems that we were encountering and to, advance the American aerospace sector, including, touching on aerospace policy, for example, and what does good policy look like at sort of a legislative or executive level for advancing the American aerospace sector. I think for me, that was kind of the natural pivot from just working on aerospace topics in the intelligence community into what's the most effective way to fix those.
Mm. So now let's fast forward to today. Do you feel like you're able to make an impact in what you're currently doing? And tell us more about how you're maybe serving in your current role.
Yeah, sure. So let's see, since leaving, worked at a small satellite manufacturer that was focused on CubeSat technology. So for everything from NASA to NOAA to national security customers. I think, in that example, right? I mean, that was rapid prototyping of satellite capabilities so that you could get something on orbit in as little as half a year, which is, lightning speed compared to the pace of government. And so I think, for a couple of us that had left and gone there at the time, that was a great opportunity to really advance U.S. satellite programs and have them move much faster than they were. And then, since then, that tied into a lot of the work in the drone sector I've been doing since then. Currently running business development for a multinational drone manufacturer. And that's another place where I see a good opportunity to, bring a lot of drone technology to the U.S. Focus on onshoring manufacturing here and bringing manufacturing back into the U.S. and back into North Dakota. I think that's been really rewarding as well.
Mm. So you're helping, especially in North Dakota, bring more awareness and you're doing business development for drone manufacturing so that we can be building those locally versus outsourcing to other countries. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yep, exactly. Basically, building up the American aerospace sector here and focusing on actual manufacturing here, which I think is critical from both an economic perspective, but also national security perspective, so that we actually have control of that supply chain and that there's not Chinese spyware in the drone systems.
Mm.
So I think there are multiple reasons that we really want to be doing aerospace manufacturing here in North Dakota.
Mm. This is just fascinating to me. I just think, especially North Dakota has such a market for drones, and with our big skies and a lot of land, I know that there's a lot of stuff coming our way when it comes to drones. How do you how do you maintain your faith currently? I mean, are there certain things that you're doing or involved in that help you? Because it sounds like you have a very, you know, a job that takes up a lot of your time and your brain energy, and you're so passionate about your job. So how do you not put God on the back burner?
Yeah, so I think in some ways it's almost similar to to workouts and athletics, right? It's something that if you don't schedule around it, it's probably not going to happen. And I think a lot of people have found if you want to hit the gym regularly, you have to schedule it in. Ideally, do it early, and then build everything else around it. And I think the same is true for for Bible study. That I'm currently working through a 365-day full Bible reading plan. It's something I always wanted to do, and I decided this year was going to be the year I'd do it. And for me, I think if I set aside that time and I schedule it and I put it in the morning before the day gets busy, I think it's much more likely to happen than thinking I'll try and do it this evening after work, and something always comes up. So I think scheduling ahead of time and really putting it in your calendar is really important.
So I'm curious with your Bible plan, because different people have different philosophies on how to read the Bible.
Mhm.
Um, are you starting with Genesis and going all the way to Revelation, or do you start in the New Testament? How does your plan, the 365-day plan, how does that break up the readings?
Yeah, so this one has got 5 or 6 different shorter readings per day. So it's not purely going through cover to cover, beginning to end, page by page. It's more
Hmm.
so it pulls a couple of readings that include Old Testament and New Testament.
Hmm.
And so I'd say it's kind of loosely chronological and loosely goes through, but does have both New and Old Testament at the same time.
Hmm. That's really fascinating to me. Does it explain why it ties both new and old at the same time?
I don't know that they explicitly say it, but I think there is value in doing both at the same time in the sense that you can look at how kind of the new fulfills the old, right? And so I think I'm a big fan of doing both at the same time for that reason.
I love that. I know for me, whenever I read the Bible, I'm just always so much more drawn to the New Testament. And I think that's just natural as humans, because the Old Testament is before Jesus comes and dies for us. And then the New Testament just brings so much more hope, in my opinion. Like when you read it, it's maybe even a little bit easier to digest what it's saying, in a sense. And so that concept of simultaneously having a couple chapters from the old and a couple chapters from the new together, I love that way of reading the Bible. And I think that that might be something that works for our listeners as well.
Yeah, and I think it's been really valuable because I know, I remember trying once in the past to start purely just page by page, and I think it's really easy to get bogged down sometimes in the early family trees in the Old Testament. It's not
Yes.
necessary. It's kind of slow reading sometimes. Trees, right? And so I think it's kind of nice to do old and new at the same time. And I think especially when you look at how certain things were fulfilled with the New Testament, right? That it leads naturally into it, and it's kind of nice to do them both together.
Totally agree. I think, yes, when it starts going, Moses was the father of Jacob, and Jacob was the father of Isaac. And I'm
Yeah.
not quoting the Bible. I know that's not exactly right. But when it starts listing out all the names, and then you can only pronounce half of the names, my eyes kind of go cross-eyed a little bit. And then I have to tell myself, okay, refocus. Let's read
Yeah.
through this a second time. But knowing that you can kind of, yeah, combining some of that New Testament with the Old Testament to help you see both sides of the story at the same time, I think that's really cool. So
Mhm.
might try to do that. And now, is this an app, the 365-day challenge, or is it online, or where do you get the?
Yeah, this was it was just a 365-day plan that I found on YouVersion. So I just found a good one there that came recommended, and been happy with it so far. I'm a couple days behind, but not too far. So but I think
Awesome.
also there's sometimes that there's an element of life happens, and if you're doing a 365-day reading plan, and it ends up being 370 days or 380 days, you can cut yourself some slack and understand you're still making it through and making progress. And so you might fall behind by a few days, but don't let that trip you up.
I appreciate that, Will. I know for me, I'm trying to read my Bible every day. I didn't set a like I'm going to read it in a year, but I more so decided I'm going to sit down and I'm going to read my Bible every day, and I'm going to absorb the information and enjoy what I'm reading. So that's been kind of my approach, because I think sometimes I can read a couple chapters, other times I only read a small passage, but just like working that muscle to get into the Bible, I think is so has been really helpful to me. But I also think that having more of a plan, like what you're doing, probably would help me to stay on more of a consistent track.
Mhm.
But I love what you said about cutting yourself slack. If you miss a day, that doesn't mean you have to throw the whole
Yep.
plan out the window.
Yep.
So
Yep.
that's really good.
One other nice thing too is having some kind of small group that you can discuss things with. I think that's been really valuable. I've got both my men's group at my church that meets on a monthly basis, but also there's kind of a small group that I run with a couple other friends, and all of us have done some federal or national security work together in the past. And I think even just kind of having a group chat there, where instead of just meeting up on a weekly or monthly basis, if you're reading something and it comes up and you have a question and you want to ask the other guys, what does this passage mean, right? What's your interpretation? I think it's kind of nice having a group chat for that too.
Totally. Having that consistent text thread of friends that are all Christians that you can share what you're thinking about with, but also ask questions to. Maybe if you're like, hey, how do you interpret this verse? I think that could be really powerful.
Yeah, and I think also it's combination of that study element, but also things like prayer requests, right? Or if someone is going through something difficult, or prayer requests for their family, right?
Absolutely. No, I think that's really, really good. Um, I want to switch gears real quick, because I know you're also going through a leadership program through the University of Mary,
Mhm.
correct?
Yep.
Tell us more about that. And are there things that you're learning in that program that you also can apply to your faith? Tell us more about that experience.
Yeah, sure. So currently in cohort 4 of the Leadership North Dakota program, which is done through the University of Mary. It's been a great program so far. Basically, we meet on a monthly basis for about 2 days each month. Each time is a different city in North Dakota. And typically it'll focus on a different industry each time. So, it'll be everything from, the mining industry to agriculture to military, but then also looking at what leadership lessons might apply to each of those. And, given that the University of Mary also has, faith-based background too, there's a certain element of faith-based leadership and servant leadership too. And so, we went through and read not only, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, but also Sister Thomas's book, was the one that was the most recent leader of the university. So I think that's been useful too, looking at leadership, but also servant leadership and faith-based leadership.
Hmm. Is there any big takeaway that you've had or something that's changed the way that you view leadership after going through or being a part of this type of program?
So I'm still halfway through it right now, but I think already there's been a very big focus on kind of servant leadership and thinking maybe in more of a proactive sense versus a reactive sense about how you plan, right? And I think that's been nice of in the same way that there's value in sitting down and maybe doing your scripture reading in the morning right ahead of time, the same kind of thing for planning ahead your day and week and month. And I think that actually frees up more time for things like a Bible reading plan, because instead of constantly putting out fires every 48 hours and focusing on the next day in front of you, you actually get a little more time to plan ahead on the things that are more important in life.
Hmm. Well, that's really, I'm thinking you're speaking directly to me in my life because I go through seasons in my work where I am so good at preparing and coming to my meetings prepared and having a plan for the next couple months. And then all of a sudden I'll go through a couple months where planning goes out the window. And as you're talking about this, I'm thinking, I can't be the best leader, and I definitely can't serve those around me to my best capacity if I haven't taken time to plan. And so I
Mhm.
haven't really ever thought about the importance of planning in a more biblical Christian sense, but I do hear what you're saying as being very valuable. If we take more time to plan our day, that leaves space so that we can have more time with God throughout our day and throughout our week.
And I think also, obviously I'm not perfect about this, and it's the same in my life. It goes in
Yeah,
waves too. Some
right.
weeks are much more reactive than others. But
Yep.
I think also there's also an element of I was speaking with a woman who's involved in her church leadership at the Emerging Prairie Retreat. When I went on that, there's the Founders Retreat that we all went on, and she was talking about the value in kind of a personal Sabbath, right? Of really making it a priority to set aside Sundays, both for not only church but also family and relaxation. And I think we know we're supposed to do that, but obviously Sunday is sometimes the catch-up day before Monday and the work week. And so I think
Mhm.
sometimes planning ahead the week and month ahead of you means you actually get a better Sabbath Sunday to focus on.
Mm, absolutely. No, I think that's yes, you just changed my lens through which I was saying planning, because I always think of it as, okay, if I have extra time, then I'm
Mhm.
going to slide in some time to get organized. That, like, I should be putting that, well, putting God first, but then putting that second, because if I can take more time to be prepared, again, I'm going to show up better for everyone else around me. Nobody wants a frazzled Kelsey. That doesn't go over well, and it makes me crabby. So yeah, I just think that that's really cool, thinking about servant leadership and the importance that preparation plays in being a good servant leader.
Mhm.
That's really cool. Um, Another thing I wanted to just ask a little bit is, I know you're really into fitness. Now, I didn't prepare you for this question, but I'm just curious, how does, being into fitness and running marathons and doing all of these different things that you've done and that you plan to do in your fitness life, how has that been a part of, keeping you strong in your faith? Does that play a role?
Yeah, so I think there's actually kind of an interesting interaction there, and some of it almost gets historical. If you go back 100 years, there was this movement in kind of the 1910s to 1920s of muscular Christianity, right? And if you look at the foundation of the YMCA, for example, right, that was the Young Men's Christian Association, right? And there was kind
Oh,
of this interaction between the idea of physical fitness and spiritual fitness, and those both being things that you take care of together. Or even if you look at, there's some modern groups like F3 is one where it's a CrossFit style fitness organization that also typically has a scripture reading at the end. And I think those groups end up being really good because there's that element of fellowship, but also fitness at the same time. And so even just for my small group that we have with the 4 of us, where we've got this chat that we do, A lot of that discussion ends up being fitness focused on personal fitness goals in addition to those faith goals. And I think they actually mesh really well when you focus on kind of how you take care of yourself.
Hmm. That's you are just, yeah, there's so many things. The fellowship and fitness, I'm thinking that is just something that I also haven't really thought about. I've been a group fitness junkie myself. I've done a couple marathons. Both times I got hurt. So, well, I don't think I'm going to be doing any more marathons in my life. I got stress fractures in my legs both times I tried. But I do think that the camaraderie and the conversations that you can have both during but also before and after working out, I think that's really powerful. And I even think about I always think that my mind is cleared after I get out and even go for just a walk, and thinking about how can we incorporate God into a walk or into a workout. And I think that I've never I've I shouldn't say I've never, because I just said I got hurt when I ran a marathon, but I typically don't feel worse after getting in some movement. And so thinking about how can we partner that movement with our faith, I think that's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome.
It's interesting too, because if you go back and you look at even some of the writings of Teddy Roosevelt, right? If you look at one book that he wrote, "Fear God and Do Your Own Part," that's one of my favorites that he wrote. And he was seen as almost one of the founders of that concept of muscular Christianity, of both taking care of yourself physically and also spiritually.
Muscular Christianity. I've never heard that phrase before. And that's really, really cool. So I'm gonna I'll make sure to link in the show notes that book, Fear God and Do Your Own Part. And it sounds like that's something that you've read.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and that's one of the books that was written by Teddy Roosevelt, and that's one that I really got a lot out of and enjoyed a lot.
No, that's really, really awesome. Gosh, I think are there any other books that you would recommend to our listeners that you've really enjoyed reading? It sounds like you like to read a lot.
Yeah, so I'm definitely a big fan of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I mean, almost anything by C.S. Lewis, but I think especially Mere Christianity, both based on the impact that had on me personally, but also, even in my small group, right? We went back and we read that about 2 months ago, and I think you get something new out of it every single time. So I definitely always recommend that one, even if you read it in years past. I'd say it's worth going back to.
Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Okay. We'll link that one as well in our show notes. I also love C.S. Lewis. I just think very, very good author, has a lot of good concepts to share. So thank you for that. I guess, one of the biggest things that we had talked about making sure that we covered in our conversation today was just this concept of having a calling. And I know we've talked about it already quite a bit, but I wanted to just circle back to that before we head towards closing our conversation and just think about, are there ways, if our listeners are struggling with maybe determining or deciphering what is my calling, what advice would you give to them?
Yeah, so I think really if there's one takeaway, probably the single most important thing is understanding that a calling does exist for you, right? And that's something that's objectively true and that it exists, right? And even if you haven't figured it out yet, right, that the important part is that it does exist, and that you keep searching for it, and that it'll be revealed when the time is right, right? And it might even shift over time. But I think, if you look at, especially among young people, a lot of the kind of despair or feeling of hopelessness right now is this feeling that objective truth doesn't exist and that there's not necessarily a true objective purpose in their life. And I think, nothing could be further from the truth, right? I think there absolutely is a calling for each individual. And, you might have to search for it. It might take longer than you want, but eventually you'll find it.
Is there anything you do to remind yourself of, that you're living in your calling?
I think it's worth having it be kind of a regular dialogue with God in the sense of, recurring prayer, of checking back in, right? And not just assuming that the calling that you first discover is going to be the same one for the rest of your life, right? I think it's it's important to check back in and make sure that you're still on track.
I love that. I know that we talk with businesses and individuals some around how, to your point, it's not like this lightning bolt is going to come out of the sky and say, this is your calling. It's something that probably evolves over time. And I think just hearing your story about how you felt like you were called to the CIA, but then now you feel like you can serve in a different capacity, and just prayerfully having those conversations with God and saying, hey, am I living in my calling? Am I doing what you're calling me to do with my life? Am I serving people in the way that you're wanting me to serve? It's really inspiring to hear how that journey has evolved for you.
And I think also, it's important to understand too that your calling might not purely be your profession that pays the bills, right? It might be volunteer work. It might be related to your family. So it doesn't purely have to be just how you pay your rent.
Thank you so much for saying that, Will, because I think, and I was just having a conversation with someone yesterday around how when we introduce ourselves, oftentimes we say, I'm Kelsey and here's where I work. And it's so common that we lead with our work, but we're so much more than the work that we do. And I think that, to your point, I think that this younger generation feels so much pressure to have a job where they can truly make such a huge impact, but knowing that the impact that you're being called to make might be outside of your 8 to 5 job. I know it could even just be as a parent, being a mom. I'm called to be a mom. I'm called to serve on this committee. I'm called to help a friend rediscover their purpose. And so I think that there's so many different ways that our calling might emerge. And just what you said about it doesn't have to be just your work. I think that's really powerful. So thank you. Is there anything else, Will, that you were hoping you would have a chance to share today in our conversation with our audience?
I think really just a lot of things come back to the importance of those small groups. And I know, this is something that came up reading some of the writings that Rod Dreher wrote over the last couple of years in terms of Benedict option or live not by lies. I think those are interesting because, he ties it back to the writings of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, right, the political dissident in the Soviet Union, and looks at, from kind of a Cold War perspective, that the reason that the church survived in a lot of these countries when there was political oppression was because they had small groups. And it really was small groups and kind of home church setups that allowed people to keep their faith, even when there was political repression of the larger church. And so I think it's just interesting looking historically at a lot of Eastern Europe and looking at how the small group was actually one of the most critical elements of the church infrastructure.
You just brought that full circle back to what we talked about at the beginning. I think that that's so true to have small groups of people because we go to church and it's a mass audience, right? And you can connect with people there, you connect with the message, but what happens when you leave the church, having a small group of people that you can connect with on a deeper level, I can see where that is just so, so powerful, to keep you not only strong in your faith, but also if things do become in a state of unrest, you can still have those tight-knit relationships to lean on.
Yep, absolutely.
That's wonderful. Well, Will, how can we find you? How can we stay connected with you and support you?
Yeah, sure. So I'd say find me on LinkedIn, or if you go to www.willcromarty.com, it's my personal website there. And always happy to talk book recommendations, faith, anything else.
Oh, I love it. Well, Will, this has been so much fun. I took a full page of notes of all these things that you've taught me, even just in our short conversation today. I'm so grateful for our time together. Thank you for sharing all your wisdom. I know that our listeners are probably just eating it up and hopefully absorbing all of the great ideas that you have for us. So thank you for your time.
And thank you for having me.